Hey all, Spino here. Listen, collecting figures is not an easy task, for I have many options to choose from. It's like choosing between Pepsi or Coke, but in the end you end up choosing A&W, and all they have left is Dr. Pepper. I don't know where I was going with that analogy, I just couldn't think of a proper intro. So picture this, you just got yourself into Godzilla, and all of your friends are talking about their latest and greatest Godzilla figures. You, however, have none, and don't know where to start. Well, considering the franchise has been around for over 70 years, there's been a lot of merchandise released since then, and it's hard to figure out where to start. There's SH Monster Arts, a line dedicated to producing highly detailed Godzilla figures with many monsters, but suffers from QC issues and overabundance of repaints, and is not budget friendly. There's Playmates, which has much cheaper figures, but doesn't have as much monster variety and isn't always the best looking. And let's not even go near Funko Pops. What we need to find you is a balance, a line of figures that are cheap, are of decent quality, and come with plenty of monster variety. We'll say hello to Bandai vinyls. Bandai vinyls are what I consider to be the perfect beginner's first for a Godzilla collection. A Godzilla collection just doesn't seem complete without them, alongside the movies too. Now, you might be asking what exactly is a Bandai vinyl. Well, they're vinyl figures of kaiju, mostly from the Godzilla franchise, made by Bandai. They've been making them for years, but I couldn't find when exactly they started. The closest I was able to find when it started was in the 1980s. The line continued into the 90s, which even spawned a TV show featuring characters played by the figures. And yes, you can buy some of the figures that appear in the show. They were eventually brought over to the US in the 2000s, which were available at Toys R Us and Kmart. I know this from experience. Can you tell that I'm old? And they're still making them to this day. Now, there are many things to know about these figures despite how simple they may look, so I'll be giving a basic overview of what you'll be getting into when you buy one of these. Note that I'm not a complete expert on this subject, but I'll try my best to explain what you'll need to know. So here we have your basic Bandai vinyl. The vinyl used is soft but sturdy. However, there are some that are made out of harder materials. The texture varies from figure to figure depending on the monster you get, but they're not sharp. Even the ones with spikes or sharp edges are soft. Now, I'll be going over a few things about them, such as the paint applications, articulation, scale, pricing, and some additional information. First, let's go over the paint. The quality of the paint applications usually tend to vary from figure to figure. On some of them, they're either applied very well for the price you paid for it, or they offer the bare minimum. Oddly enough, the paint apps on some older figures are better than recent releases. For example, here's a Final Wars Gigan figure released between 2004 and 2005. Notice how well detailed it is. Now here's a promo shot of the one released in 2019. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Now some figures might have special colored variants released as exclusives for certain events, or simply as another version of the figure. Take for example Shin Godzilla, who has plenty of these, ranging from a theater exclusive, a Godzilla store exclusive, an Atomic Breath version, or a version of him that's frozen. There's even some exclusives from 7-Eleven, very fitting that it's in the same color of a blueberry Slurpee. Next, let's go over articulation. This will vary from figure to figure, as some monsters aren't as posable as others. Some might have a swivel at the head, some might not. The arms might rotate to the sides, can do a 360, or simply lack articulation entirely. Some figures might have a rotation at the waist, others might not. And finally, if the figure you have has a tail, you might be able to rotate it, or you might not. Some figures might even have little to no articulation at all.
Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that if your figure has legs, it can either rotate around, or it might not for some reason. I don't know why that is.
So overall, the articulation of these figures aren't exactly the best, but it's just enough for some playability, or something to place on your desk. As for the scale, your standard vinyl figure will be around the 6-inch range, but will vary by length depending on the monster you get. For a comparison, here's the Figma Sake Izuyoi, the NECA SOS Goji, and the Emmer Collection Velociraptor. However, there are figures that fall into other scales. For example, there are ones that are 3 inches, 8 inches, and even 12 inches, but the most common ones will be the 6-inch ones. That's what she said. Now as for the prices of these figures, I did mention that they're budget friendly, with most being in the $20 to $50 range, but I think paying over $50 for one might be a bit too much. However, depending on the version and the rarity of the figure, they might reach into the $100 range. Of course, you don't have to get that into it. I didn't have to pay that much when I bought these. Just be mindful with your wallet. As for where to buy them, well, that's a bit tricky. You see, a majority of the figures that I have weren't purchased in the US, but at certain stores in Thailand. There were a few figures I did buy online from eBay, and I didn't run into any issues. Some places, like Big Bad Toy Store, Entertainment Earth, and Amazon, do sell them, but things like shipping costs and taxes might vary. However, they should all be at the same price range that I mentioned previously. Lastly, I'll give you some additional notes. Depending on where the figure was released, they'll come packaged in one or two ways. For most Western releases, they'll be packaged in an open box. This is what us Godzilla fans in the early 2000s grew up with. Alongside this, for the Eastern releases, they come with no packaging, and come with a tag instead. This is because they're not on shelves, but on racks. Tags are also a good way of telling when the figure was released, as many of them get re-released under different lines. You might find them loose without packaging or a tag, but that's if they're pre-owned or used. However, some come in box sets that don't include tags. Now, it's heavily debated on whether or not you should keep these figures with or without the tag. In my opinion, I think it's best to remove the tag. It'll get in the way of playing with the figure, and it might get damaged if exposed. But that doesn't mean you should get rid of the tag entirely. It still has some value. If you plan on keeping the tag, don't try to rip it out forcefully. There is a very simple way of removing and retrieving it safely. First, what you want to do is apply some heat to it, most preferably with a hairdryer. Try to only use enough heat as you can, as it will cause the vinyl to warp or even melt. That hasn't happened to me before, but it's best to keep things safe. Then, carefully remove the tag and place it into some card sleeves. Once that's done, put it into a safe place.
I know I wasn't able to actually get the tag back in for this demonstration, but I hope you guys were able to get all that.
As for the box releases, that one's up to you if you'd like to keep them packaged. As for me, I want my figures to be free. That and they take up too much space. Another thing to note is there are plenty of bootlegs of these figures out there. One way to tell is how it's painted. If it's brightly colored, mismatched, or if their eyes look like they're on every single drug at once, then it's a bootleg. Plus, what makes things so difficult is that they don't come with tags, and considering that a lot of loose Bandai vinyls also don't come with tags, it might be a bit tricky to those who don't have a good eye, so be careful when you're out shopping for them. One last thing to note is that there are vinyl figures of other monsters outside of the Godzilla franchise, such as Gamera, Evangelion, and Ultraman. The Ultraman figures are roughly an inch shorter than the Godzilla figures. Unfortunately, I don't know about it as much as the Godzilla line, so that's all I have to say about them. Now that you've gotten that info down, you might be asking yourself if there's a proper way to start. What, did you think I had a plan in mind when I started collecting these? No, of course not! I just bought whatever monster I liked, what figure looked the best, and if I could afford it. There's no definitive way of starting a collection of these. Just buy one and go off from there. Pick whatever you're comfortable with and continue after that. Sure, you could collect from a specific line or buy monsters from a specific movie, but you don't have to do any of that. There's a lot of these figures out there, and your options are far from limited. And just to prove it to you, allow me to show off a few of them in my collection, so you have a better idea of what you're in for. Let's start this off with Jet Jaguar. Jet's paint job is really good and spot on, but I'm not a fan of the pose he's in. Bandai vinyls are usually in a neutral pose, and I'm not into figures in a permanent action pose. There is a Jet Jaguar figure that's more neutral, but I wasn't able to find it. Despite this figure is not bad. Next up is Godzilla himself from the Heisei era. Godzilla's paint is mostly minimal, with the claws being a yellowish white and the dorsal spines being a light gray. On the other hand, the face has more precise details, like the eyes, teeth, and tongue. However, as for the actual design itself, it's a bit tricky to identify. You see, while at first glance it might look simple, the Heisei design, or I should say designs, is a topic that drives me insane. So here's the deal. The Heisei design is used in a lot of promotional material. In fact, it's probably the design you might think of when you hear Godzilla. The problem is, despite looking very similar to each other, if you put two Heisei designs together, they're actually different. There are very slight differences to the point where they're classified as different suits, technically because they are. What makes things even more confusing is that during the production of some of the Heisei movies, they used two very similar yet different suits, one of which was infamous for being stolen during the production of one of the films. And keep in mind that this kept happening for 5 years, with the 84 and Burning suits being the ones with the more notable differences. As for what specific incarnation this figure is, my guess is that it's the Radogoji design from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. But given all that I've said, I could be wrong on that. Now, the design this figure uses was also used prior for the suit used in Godzilla vs. Mothra, but I've already rambled long enough about this topic. If I keep this up, I might end up with an aneurysm. Overall, this is a very solid Godzilla figure. Now, this next monster has a very interesting backstory behind it, mainly because it's one of the many monsters that never made it into a movie. Behold, Bagan. Alright, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this guy, so allow me to give you a brief history on who this is and why the existence of this figure is crazy. Bagan is a monster that's infamous for having a hard time trying to exist. There have been multiple designs and movies for Bagan that sadly never went through. However, one of the designs made its way outside of the movies, getting used in 2 Godzilla games, Super Godzilla and Godzilla Movie Studio Tour, which is what this figure is based off of. Now, Bagan wouldn't make another official appearance until 2022 in the web series Godzilla-Bagan. As for the figure itself, it's honestly really amazing. It's not just the fact that it exists. He looks fierce. The design is very interesting, consisting of body armor and muscle, with 3 menacing horns adorning his head. Although I don't know why his pecs and crotch have armor on them. It's as if he evolved to be immune to crotch kicks. The paint apps are done very cleanly, especially on the shiny purple orbs on his shoulders. There's only one spot of paint scuff on the knee, but that doesn't ruin it. Overall, it's a surprising inclusion to the line. It's one of my favorite figures in my collection. Getting into the Millennium era, we've got Godzilla 2000, or Mirai Goji. I actually have 2 figures of this incarnation. The first one is from a wave of the Bandai America line of vinyls called the Fusion Wave. It was a selection of monsters that were released previously, now in a glittery translucent mold. I remember getting this at a Kmart when it was still alive, but I'm not the biggest fan of it. Like I said before about Jet Jaguar, I'm not a fan of figures like this in an action pose, let alone one in motion. I either want to be the one to put the figure in motion, or have it kept in a neutral pose. Which is why years later, I bought another Mirai Goji. The pose looks good, and the eyes have more detail than the other one. However, some of the dorsal plates are fused with the sculpt, and there's silver coming from the bottom of them, which is weird since the actual suit doesn't have this. Plus, the body is too dark. You can't really tell that it's actually green. Of course, I know that there are other versions of this figure that don't have these issues, but I couldn't find them. But if given the choice between the two, I choose the normal one out of personal preference. Orga's in the house, and he ate all of the cherry popsicles. Orga, in my opinion, is a kaiju that's kind of underrated. He's a very interesting alien kaiju with his small head, hunched back, and big meaty claws. I never understood why he has this shiny blue paint on his forehead, or the white on his belly, since he's mostly gray. That, and the scenes he was shot in were in the dark. The only issue he has is that his arm has a gash in it, which was something I didn't notice until I wrote this script. But overall, he's a pretty neat figure, and he's a pretty cool alien. Next up is King Ghidorah from GMK. I bought this at a Walmart a while ago because I don't have a lot of Ghidorah figures, and I'm not the biggest fan of it. The paint looks dull, the necks are too close to each other, the gums go into the teeth, and it doesn't look very imposing. So let's see what Japan got. Yeah, so Japan got this beast of a figure. The paint's much shinier, the necks are spread further apart, the teeth are individually sculpted, and the figure is very imposing with its giant wingspan and much larger scale. The only issue I have with it is that the legs are sculpted as being bent, but I still love it. It's my favorite Ghidorah figure I have so far. Final Wars Rodan is here, and he's a pretty solid figure. No, seriously, he's basically a brick. The only articulation he has is at his calves. Among the sea of red covering up a majority of his body, his eyes are an emerald green. I don't know if this was intentional or just a coincidence, but this reminds me of Knuckles, and I'm not even a Sonic fan. Overall though, he looks pretty good. Up next I've got Final Wars Gigan. Final Wars Gigan is the definition of edgy, both figuratively and literally. Those Zillions gave him metal spikes wherever they could, and had I gotten his upgraded form, it would have been more. In fact, each metal part of Gigan looks really great. It's as if it's made out of actual metal, but like the rest of the figure, it's soft. If this was made out of anything harder, I'd be bleeding. The Zillions are probably my favorite alien race in Godzilla. They're dressed edgy, and their monsters are edgy, which is why this incarnation of Gigan is my favorite. The next kaiju I've got is Final Wars Anguirus, one of my favorite incarnations of the character. I couldn't really think of that much to say about him, other than he looks good. His spikes look like bananas. The other incarnation that I like, and might as well show off, is Singular Point Anguirus. I also couldn't think of anything to say about him, other than he looks good. Unlike Final Wars Anguirus, Singular Point Anguirus has much larger spikes, but like Gigan, these won't cause you to bleed. So overall, these are pretty good. That's all I could say about them. The next few figures are of Godzilla himself. To start, I've got Shin Godzilla's forms. Let's start out with his first one, which happens to be very popular. Yeah, it's technically his second form, but the first one is just his tail. Nicknamed Kamata-kun, this guy's pretty well known for looking kinda goofy, in a weird, adorable way. In fact, he was so popular that I wasn't able to find this figure because it went out fast. But now that I have him, I think he's pretty neat. Let's move on to his next form, nicknamed Shinagawa-kun. As you you can see, he looks like he's made out of ketchup. On his tail, you can tell that his second head is forming. He looks pretty decent, but there's one issue that this thing has. Because of how small his arms are, they're sculpted onto his body. They didn't bother giving him proper arms? Why? But overall, this figure ain't bad. To round out the forms, here's Shin Godzilla himself, nicknamed Kamakura-san. He's looking pretty solid. He has an eerie face, and his second head on his tail looks great. However, I think this figure has a bit of a problem. It's too black. I think if they added a little bit more red, like at the dorsal plates and running down his tail, then it'd be a bit better. But other than that, the figure's good. The next Godzilla is from King of the Monsters. While a majority of his body is a charcoal gray, his dorsal plates are painted blue. I would make a comment about how the paint looks like it's been spray painted on there. And yeah, it does. However, if it wasn't painted on there, then the rest of the figure would look really bland. It's a nice touch since Godzilla glowed more in this movie. Overall, it's a really solid figure of this design. And finally, here's Gemstone Godzilla, a design that has really grown on me. For those of you who don't know, this version of Godzilla is from a series of short movies created by the Gemstone Creative label, and the design itself is amazing. It's like a modernized take on the Heisei design. It's a very solid look for him. The face looks menacing, the eyes are painted cleanly, the dorsal plates are organized well on his back, and he even has 5 fingers, something only Zilla had. As of me writing this script, there's no awakened version of this figure, which would have been really cool to see. But overall, this is a very fine figure. And that was a walkthrough of Bandai vinyls. As you can see, there are a lot of them out there, and now that you have a much better understanding of the line, you won't be as overwhelmed when starting out. Like I said before, there's no one way of starting off. Just pick whichever one you want and go off from there. Soon enough, you'll be on your way to becoming a Godzilla collector. Hope you enjoy it while you can, because it can get addicting, and there's no going back. Well, I hope this was a helpful guide, and that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video, whenever that'll be. Hey, hold up a second. I think I'm forgetting something. I think I left out a figure. It probably isn't too important. What the heck was that? Oh hey, it's the Kyushu J7W Shinden. That's weird. What's this thing doing here? And why is it so close to my mouth?